Welcome to Integrative Medicine with Dr. Leland Stillman, the podcast where we explore the best of East and West, old and new, conventional and unconventional, in search of answers to medicine's toughest cases and most difficult problems. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Diagnostics and therapeutics discussed on this podcast may or may not be right for you. So talk to a qualified practitioner before taking action based on what you learn here. If you'd like to become a patient at my practice, go to stillmanmd.com to schedule a complimentary discovery call. Thank you for listening and welcome to today's episode. Hello, everyone. Dr. Stillman here with Amy Arp. Our guest today is Jim Laird, who those of you who've been following me for a long time should know very well. Today, we have a very exciting conversation on this episode of Stories of Hope, Stories of Healing. We are going to be talking to Jim about his journey through the world of health and wellness, a very unlikely place for him to have found himself, given his early life. And Jim, where I'd like to start today is where you were and who you were and what was going on in your life when you first were confronted with let's call it the specter of illness, having to assess or face a serious health crisis.
That is a great question. It's interesting because I had little warnings earlier in my life, particularly looking back now. I had something called Osgood-Schlatters disease.
Osgood-Schlatter,
which
yeah.
is basically where Osgood-Schlatters, thank you. It's basically where your quads end up pulling the cartilage off, the bone, and you end up with, it's very painful, and I have these huge bumps on my knees. And the answer to that was to put my body in giant leg casts at the time.
How old were you?
And really knowing what I was probably in middle school, and knowing now what I know, that was because I was an extremely high threshold strategy that was really jamming my pelvis forward. And that was basically, now that when I train kids that have, Osgood-Schlatters, I know I need to improve their pelvic position and their hip function, and I'm able to get them better in a few months. But it was because of the high threshold strategy that I was using to dominate, destroy everyone, that got me into that place. So that was a warning. I just didn't understand it at the time. And then, multiple injuries, hamstring pulls.
What do you mean by dominate and destroy people?
So I basically used extension to basically create tons of force, like high-level sprinters, high-level weightlifters will use this extended position, this over-breathing state, to create intensity, to create force. Like offensive linemen tend to go into this camp. You look at Usain Bolt, he has a lot of, anterior pelvic tilt extension, which allows him to run faster.
Mm-hmm.
That was where I lived. I never shut that off. So I was constantly in this like go, go, go kind of state. And I never, ever did anything. Well, when I was young, I would go play and go fishing and things like that.
You were living in?
I was caught in Canada at the time.
What town? Give us some more context, Jim.
Well, I was born in Red Lake, Ontario, which is a gold mining town in the middle of nowhere, above Dryden Lake of the Woods. Then I moved to Winnipeg, Manitoba to the third grade, and then I moved to Edmonton, Alberta. I grew up in a little town called Fort Saskatchewan. And I played every sport imaginable. And sports was my way of dealing with what was currently going on in my childhood, which the events of my childhood caused a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. And I used to act out in school. And then, of course, they told me to get into sports because there was an appropriate place to take that anger and that frustration out. So I got reinforcement to basically hurt people and praised for it by, hitting people in hockey and in soccer, slide tackling, things like that, in football, eventually wrestling. And then so I got done playing college football and, I had a brief stint, a couple pro tryouts, and then I was just too short. And then
those pro tryout stories are pretty funny.
Yeah, they are. But then the next obvious step was powerlifting because I was really strong. I lifted weights for a long time. And then so my big major health scare was ulcerative colitis, and that was around 2008, 2009.
And you were how old?
Basically, we'll do the math on that.
16 years ago.
16, yeah, 16 years ago. So 50 minus 16. It makes it easy. I'm terrible at math in my head.
34.
Yeah, so I was in my early 30s. 30, thank you. I was in my mid to early 30s.
What was your life like then, Jim?
Get up at 5 a.m, train probably. I was working with multiple high schools. I was training groups of people, individuals, from literally 5 o'clock in the morning until 8, 9 o'clock at night. And I was training, lifting during the day at a very high level.
What does that mean?
Benching. Well, I was an elite level power lifter. So I was doing things like benching well over 500 pounds raw, benching 700 pounds with a bencher, squatting close to 1,000 pounds, doing good mornings with 1,000 pounds, deadlifting well over 700 pounds, dumbbell pressing the 150-pound dumbbells for sets of 20, things like that. And every workout was
no big
a
deal.
show.
It's just like
Right. But every workout was a show. There was lots of huffing and puffing and all that stuff. Hitting your head against the bar, between
some loud music going on.
So yeah, people could hear my music on the other side of the gym. I mean, Metallica, Pantera, Slayer on level 150.
Through your
ammonia
headphones?
Caps. Oh yeah, ammonia caps. Sniffing that ammonia cap and getting like that, and
Yeah.
So that was every workout, which was really dumb because you actually, when you train, you don't want to get revved up, because when you go to the meet, if you have to rely on getting revved up at the meet, one, you look like a total fool, and two, you usually don't have any gas left to get revved up at the meet, and the meet goes over a whole day. So you really should be in training. You should be focusing on technique and technicality, and not going to that war cry unless you really have to. Maybe if it's so you do 3 attempts in the squat, you do 3 attempts in the bench, you do 3 attempts in the deadlift. So you start off, I'm usually in the second flight because my openers were usually 700-800 pounds on the squat. And so there'd be 2 groups. So it'd be the people that are lifting the lighter weights first. They'd all go through. We'd be warming up while they would go. And then I would squat. And the first group is warming up for the bench. So this could, start at usually the big heavy guys usually lifted in the afternoon. So a lot of times these meets would start at 3 o'clock and they might go to 11. We had one go to midnight. So because you're going through, so it's an endurance event, essentially. You can't get like this for that long a period of time. So I could have lifted a lot more and been a lot more successful if I'd have had a more methodical, technical approach. This is what I made my clients do. I never really liked loud music. I didn't like, shaking people and all that stuff that a lot of people do. So that was kind of the status of what was going on at the time. And I'll give you some other background to that. But basically, I'd had a whole bunch of catastrophes that I'll go into in a moment. But I remember I was working at a CrossFit, actually. I was working at a CrossFit, and I just went into the bathroom, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. And, basically, my dad had colitis, so I was pretty familiar with what was going on. And, I went to the hospital and they were like,
you're leaving out the key detail there, Jim, which is you went to the bathroom and evacuated a large quantity of blood.
And kept evacuating a large quantity of blood. So I went to the hospital and they were like, hey, we're going to put you on corticosteroids, which I think is fine to help calm things down.
Sure.
But they were like, we need a surgery, and I saw what happened to my dad. My dad was a night shift worker. He got colitis. They put him on prednisone. They never told him about dietary change. They never told him about lifestyle change. He just kept eating pizza at 3 o'clock in the morning and Chinese food and Cheetos and all the things that he loved to eat. And then a year or two later, he's got an ostomy bag, right? And I saw that, and I was just like, this is not going to be for me. So I got an
Explain for a
IV.
moment for those who don't know, what is an
Mhm.
ostomy bag?
An ostomy bag is where you basically defecate in a bag
Defecate, yes.
that's attached to your body. And
Although
that is not my
to be
idea of a good time.
put a fine point on that, so ostomies depend upon what's happened to the colon. So ulcerative colitis is an autoimmune
Sure.
disease. It affects the colon. It can affect any
Yes.
like it usually is the term. I mean, I believe it's the terminal end of it. So as close to the rectum as possible, and then it can go up all the way through the entire colon. And there's a lot of you try to manage these patients non-surgically in the conventional medical world because obviously the colon's important. People don't like not having a colon because what comes out of the small intestine into the colon is liquid. Ostomies can be made from the small intestine, or they can be made from portions of the large intestine, and how much large intestine you have left essentially determines how firm your stool is. But the ostomy comes out through the abdominal wall, which means that if you wind up with an ostomy, you get to poop into a bag that you then empty from your abdominal wall. This is it's actually very interesting when you look at studies on this. They find that people contemplate being absolutely miserable with an ostomy bag, but when you ask people who've had an ostomy bag for a period of time how happy they are, they're as happy as they were before the ostomy bag. But which implies that you can adjust or adapt to this change. But, be that as it may, I think everyone can agree that it's better not to have to resort to this.
Yeah. Of course, being a young man at the time, I immediately thought about what that was going to do to my personal life. And I just did not like that at all. So
How do
I
you break
basically
that
walked out of
on
the
the date?
Yeah, hey baby, by the way, I have a surprise for you.
Well, it's it's sad. What's got to be even harder is if you're a young lady.
Oh, that would be so hard.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. So good point. So I literally told them that I had no interest in that. And I literally walked out of the ER, and they literally told me, we're not going to let you leave. And I was like, good thing we're in the emergency room, because if you don't let me leave, there's going to be a lot of people in the emergency room, but they don't have to go anywhere. I said, you've got two choices. Either things are going to get crazy and you're going to have a lot of injured staff, or you're just going to let me leave on my own fruition. Don't make me call my attorney. And after about 10 or 15 minutes and several security guards coming in and looking at me, they said, yeah, we're just going to let this guy go. And so they let me leave.
Hold on.
So I had to sign. I had to sign. Well, and one of the guys that worked security there at where I was, I won't say the name of the hospital, he knew me, and he knew I was a national champion Roman Greco wrestler. And he was just like, and I had fought him in MMA, and he told him, he's like, this dude's a wrecking ball. Like, if he's telling you that he's going to hurt a lot of people if you don't let him leave, he's going to hurt a lot of people if you don't let him leave. And so, Jim. He was like, you really, no, I told him straight up. Like, I was honest. I was like, look, you cannot keep me here. I have the right to decide what is done to my body. And if I decide I don't want a medical procedure, I will sign the waiver that says if I die, it's not your fault. I'm happy to do. I've signed that waiver so many times in my life. It's not even funny. Probably signed that 15 or 20 times. So I immediately go home and I get on Google and I get on PubMed and I start researching colitis. What is it? Autoimmune disease. Okay, let's check off the list of causes for an autoimmune disease. Trauma, ending of relationships. So trauma, just all the stuff I'd been through. Not enough sleep, inflammation. At the time, I was trying to gain as much weight as possible. I was eating massive amounts of food, like a whole loaf of bread a day, probably 24 to 30 eggs, 2 or 3 pizzas a week, massive amounts of ice cream, just everything you could possibly imagine, because it was part of it is I probably wasn't absorbing a lot of it anyways.
Right.
But when you get to be a certain size and you're trying to put on 10 or 15 pounds, the amount of calories you have to eat to put on good weight is absolutely ridiculous. Plus, I was on performance enhancing drugs, which causes you to have an increased demand
Right.
for calories.
Give us a
right?
skinny on
And
the performance enhancing drugs. What were you on at the time?
oh boy. So I was on testosterone, probably 800 milligrams a week. I was on something called equipoise, which helps horses eat more food. I was on a little bit of Deca, which helps protect your joints. And I think I was on Dianabol at the time. So, as Ronnie Coleman says, what supplements did you take? Little test, little D-ball, little Deca, so just the basics. And I'm very honest about that. I didn't do any performance enhancing drugs when I played college football because I got drug tested a lot because I was one of the strongest guys on the team. So I got drug tested every couple of weeks. I didn't want to have to deal.
You were abusing.
Well, compared to my friends, I didn't have to take that much because that isn't a lot compared to bodybuilders and other powerlifters. Like I know people that were taking 3,000 milligrams a week of testosterone a week. I know guys that take 1,000 milligrams a day. And just to give people context, 250 milligrams is your typical. Because I was getting ready for a competition and I actually set a huge bench PR like 2 days before I almost, bled myself to death.
Yeah.
So, I would take larger amounts getting ready for a competition and then I would come off to a more therapeutic dose for a few months. And then add some androgens in that weren't as hard on the body, things like primobolan. I would take things like Anavar, things like that to preserve muscle, but allow my physiology to kind of come back into order. And I did that from the time I was 25 until I was, in my mid 30s. And so I'm very honest about it. It's allowed me to educate people that want to do it on the dangers of it, and also just kind of educate them on, what the risks are, because I've done it. I'm not just like saying, don't do it, it's bad for you. I'm saying, hey, these are the consequences. These are the trade-offs. If you do these things, these are the risks. There's a probable risk that you're probably going to have to take it for the rest of your life. There's the mental addiction of being like Captain America and feeling like Superman, and then going back to normal levels and feeling like a mere mortal. That's a giant mind, whatever words you want to fill in. So that's the addictive nature of it. So, telling a 16, 17-year-old kid, hey, you're going to have to take shots for the rest of your life if you start on this stuff, makes them at least think about things. And hey, you might want to wait until you're in your mid 20s before you start this. Get as strong as you can. And then if you decide to do it, do it when you really need it, not when you're 16 years old. But that's, of course, is a personal choice and all that sort of thing. But, I will say the anabolics allowed me to drive myself as hard as I did, and maybe prevented a heart attack, maybe, protected me from other things. I'm very lucky that my digestion was my weakest link, which is easier to fix than your heart or your brain or whatever else, right? But I wouldn't have been able to drive myself that hard if it wasn't for the stimulants, it wasn't for the testosterone. I would have been stopped dead in my tracks long before that. So it allowed me to drive my car harder for longer.
I want to focus on this moment. You were told by medical professionals, you need this procedure or you're going to die. Do you happen to remember how low your hemoglobin was at the time?
I can't remember. All I know is it was probably not that low. Well, I don't know, but it was bad. The main thing was dehydration.
Why did they tell you that you needed to have your colon out immediately? They said had they already done a procedure to look at your colon or what?
Yeah, they did all that fun stuff. But they had told me that the inflammation was so bad that they needed to stop the damage and stop the bleeding and stop me just losing, lots of fluid.
What's crazy about that, Jim, is that I remember going through training in 2010-ish. That's when I left college for medical school. And by that time, they were really, and this obviously was earlier than, actually it was around the same time. It's only a couple years earlier. They were already lecturing us on the importance of non-surgical management of this. So I'm kind of surprised that was their recommendation, but be that as it may, their recommendation was this. What went on in the mind of Jim Laird in that moment from, hey, Jim, you need to have your colon cut out surgically to no thanks, I'm leaving the hospital?
It was instant because I looked at my dad and I watched my dad disintegrate, and I was like, "There's no way I'm going out like that." You know, I'm not going out. I'm just not. That's not for me. And I
What
said,
was
"I
it
will
about
find a
that?
way."
I mean, if you're comfortable sharing, what was it about that that feeling that you got thinking about your dad's case that prompted you to make that decision?
Well, one, this is going to sound horrible, but I didn't want to be anything like my father. So, uh, did not have a good relationship with my mother or my father. So anything that he did, I wanted to be the complete opposite. And that's one of the reasons I threw myself into the weight room. That's one of the reasons I wanted to be as masculine as possible. I wanted to be the complete opposite of him. So a lot of it was just hate and spite. This is the road he went down. I am not going down that road. I am not going to be like my father. I will die trying to be the opposite of him.
And I think there's a part of that where you see him as being dependent and in some ways sort of a slave to the things he likes. The Chinese food, the pizzas, the shift
Yeah.
work.
Well,
And
I saw him. I saw him as weak, and he was. So I didn't want to be anything. I did everything in my power to be the opposite of that.
well, I also
And
sense in
so,
you a deep desire to be independent.
correct. I want to go out on my own terms. If the good Lord decides to take me in a certain way, but that's just I watched my father and what he had to go through with that, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. That's me, and forgive me if you've had this procedure. God bless you. Like I think it needs to be an individual decision. That was just my feelings at the time, and so I don't know. I probably wouldn't want one now either. But who knows? When your life is in front of you, mortality is in front of you. You tend to make different decisions. You can speak big and tough when everything's going well, but when your life's on the line, you tend to make different choices at that time because when reality's right there in your face, things tend to be a little different.
Mm.
So I started researching hard. I started researching really hard, and
Before
I
we get into the
basically had.
research,
Mhm,
I have one
yeah,
or two more questions about that.
sure.
You looking at your father, how he did clinically,
Hmm. Sure.
uh, you must have had, and I'm curious. What I'm really wondering about is when you look at how his case went,
Hmm.
what do you think his clinical team could have done differently that could have given him a different outcome that you were looking for that he didn't get?
Stop working night shift. Um, start eating real food.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they really didn't talk to him about diet. They didn't talk to him about anything. And then, of course, he ends up with, he probably already had type 2 diabetes, but he ends up a few years later getting type 2 diabetes. And of course, the recommended dietary treatment for type 2 diabetes in Canada is 6 to 8 servings of bread and rice a day. Um,
Wow.
yeah, I tried to
Crazy.
help him. I tried to help him and got him eating more of a paleo style diet. And his doctors told him it was dangerous and it would, and I basically got on the phone with them. It's like, give him 6 months, you know, and we'll see what his labs look like. And if they're worse, then he'll do whatever you want him to, but let's at least try this. He improved, but he didn't have control. He didn't have control over his addiction. He used food as comfort, and he had Cheetos and potato chips and everything else stashed all over the place. And so, I tried to help him, and he just wasn't ready. So, he's been battling diabetes. The fact that he's still alive in his 80s gives me hope because I've driven my body like a stolen car, and obviously so is he. Not to the physical extent, but the night shifts and all.
Mm.
Like night shift his entire life. He's still alive in his 80s. He's got an ostomy bag. He's got diabetes. So that gives me hope that I've at least got a few more years left,
Mm. So now tell us
particularly
what
with
happened in
the
your
interventions that I've
brain
done.
where you thought there's got to be a better way, and you immediately
Yes.
said, "Search the internet." Right? What did
Yep.
you even
Hmm.
think you would find, and what did you in fact find?
Hmm. I didn't know what I thought I was going to find at the time. And I've always been a problem solver. Like one of the things I like about my job is, one of my first clients in Lexington was a guy that fractured his spine who was 13 or 14 years old. And so I started researching, like, the kid was they put him in a back brace for 8 months, and we rebuilt him from the ground up. And so I had to basically take him like he was like an infant. And I had another girl who had blown out 3 ACLs in
Yikes.
9th or 10th grade. And so I had to research and reverse engineer and look at all the stuff she did in her physical therapy and everything she was doing to come back from her 3 knee injuries. And I was like, okay, we need to reverse engineer this and obviously do the opposite of what she'd been doing in her recovery. So I had this, when somebody came to me with rheumatoid arthritis, or they came to me with this or that, I would dig into these things and do the research. I didn't know what I would find. I thought I was, I was this big, strong guy. I could lift all these heavy things. I thought I was relatively healthy. At the time, I had the mindset of like, I don't care what it takes. Like, if you tell me if I took a pill, this is like the Olympic athlete kind of mindset. Like,
Sure.
They surveyed a bunch of Olympic athletes and they said, if we give you a pill and you would win every gold medal in the next year, but you would die in like a year, like 90% of them said, sign me up, like that's just the mentality I had at the time.
Wow.
But I really
that
didn't.
mentality?
I think reinforcement of getting validation from being, a warrior, from being, just people saying, dude, you're one bad mother effer, like I never had any validation growing up. I didn't have any, sense of self-worth or purpose. So if people were in awe, or like, they'd see me pushing 150-pound dumbbells and they'd come over and they'd be like, oh my gosh, dude, that's insane. That fed me. And so
What's
that
interesting
kind of
to me about that is that I've seen people also go the other way. They're high performers,
Right.
They're successful, then their health goes out. And rather than say, I'm going to take the same mindset that I bring to my training, no matter how they developed it, right? Whether it was a healthy mechanism, whether it was, society, their friends, their family, their school, whatever, they'll apply that and they'll say, I'm just going to take this mindset of I am invincible. I can do it. I can overcome. They won't adapt that mindset to their illness, and they'll wind up in a very much a victim, negative. And I find that that's often, frankly, inculcated by doctors and the healthcare system. You are a victim. You have a doom.
Yes.
Here is your doom. And, resign yourself to it. There's nothing you can do. There's no way you can Google your way out of this. So tell us what happened when you started to search for this.
Well, the first thing I did was like, what are the causes of this? And of course it goes into like car accidents can be a factor. And I'd just been in a car accident like 2 months before. Relationships. I had just broken up with a redheaded Scorpio that was a total disaster. It was just so much trauma. It was insane. Career change, stress. I had just had a misunderstanding at work, which led to me having to go find another place to train people. Somewhere I'd trained people for 8 or 9 years, and all of a sudden I had to find a new location. Lack of sleep, inflammation. So I had every box I checked, not able to relax, over breathing, stress, all the things like, diet, all these things. So I looked at that. And then I started like cures, and I saw, acupuncture is very effective. So I immediately scheduled an appointment with an acupuncturist. And I remember the first time I'd ever gotten acupuncture. And I laid down on the table and she started putting these needles in me. And she's like, oh my gosh, you are on fire. She's listening to my heartbeat or feeling my pulse. And she's like, I've never seen anybody as revved up as you are. And it literally, I sat there and I took a couple deep breaths. Well, the funny thing is too, this was right around the housing crisis. And I had lost probably 50% of my clients due to, they were real estate agents, they were in the horse industry, and all of a sudden all of that fell through and they owed taxes from the year before and they didn't have any money to pay it. So I lost probably 50% of my clients. And instead of being smart and saying, well, I'm going to cut my expenses, I'm just like, well, I'm going to go bounce at the local gentleman's establishment and make a couple extra $1,000 a week. So I continue to go out and eat every day and I could continue to do all these things that I was doing. I was eating out like 3 or 4 times a day, throwing money around like a fool. I tipped very generously. So that was a big part of it as well. Was, instead of resting, here I am. And the girl I was seeing, she would come over on the weekends. She lived in Ohio. And so, of course, I didn't get much rest on the weekends at all between the work and her visiting. So all these things basically pushed me off the cliff. I mean, it took a lot to basically cause this. I mean, I should not be here technically. And so I remember the first acupuncture where I just basically was forced to relax on the table. And I literally felt like I levitated off the table and started spinning around in the room. Like it felt to me like there was energy coming out of me. And that actually helped a lot. So that I started drinking aloe juice. And then I found a study that nicotine was like, 85, 90% effective in calming colitis flare up. I went right to Walgreens. I took like a whole box and I just started like, putting them everywhere on my head, everywhere I could put them. And then of course I ran into like, Rob Wolf and a guy named Paul Chek. And I started listening to, it was Sean Croxton used to have a podcast. I can't remember what the name of it was, but he interviewed Paul Chek and Rob Wolf and all. I started listening to his podcast religiously. And Paul Chek said something to me that just hit me right in the forehead. And I still use this quote all the time. In order to work out, you first have to work in. And I always thought that a day off from training, and I was really good about taking rest days, but it wasn't truly rest because I was working a 12, 14-hour day. I was drinking energy drinks just to have energy throughout the day. I would literally go sleep in between sessions and you could hear me snoring, out in the hallway. They'd be like, "Oh, Laird's sleeping again." And I'd have to set like 2 alarms and have someone come wake me up because I was so sleep deprived. Every year in the winter, I would have a massive health setback, and I'd actually gone and seen a functional medicine doctor in Lexington. I won't say his name, but you know who he is. And he did all these tests with me, and I was depleted and everything. Like my
hold on, let's make sure I want to make sure I get the timeline here right. You get the ulcerative colitis before you got Crohn's.
It was before I got ulcerative colitis because I was colitis because I was having like these periods of time where I couldn't get out of bed for like 2 or 3 days, maybe a week. So my body was giving me like you better slow and that's why I tell my clients all the time. I'm like, look, here's the choices. Your body's telling you need to stop. You can do all these things to override it and try and find a hack. But if you don't actually slow down and relax, take your car to the shop, your body will make you stop, and it's not fun. Now, most people are not going to go to the extremes that I did because most people don't have the hatred and the vitriol. And actually looking back, if it wasn't for strength training, if it wasn't for combat sports, I would be in prison. There's no doubt about it. If I didn't have that outlet for that hate and anger, I'd be in jail for sure. Right. And so I'm very grateful that I had that outlet. Obviously, it should have been handled a little differently, but
we also grew up at a time when it was not really a big deal for 2 guys to throw down, in a bar or whatever.
Especially in Canada. Well, I never got into fights publicly because I would act out in school and get in a fight. But once I had the ability to do that legally on the football field, I didn't have the need. And I'm actually very patient. I bounced in nightclubs for years. I've had people spit in my face. I'm very patient. I'm very calm. It's really weird. But, when you work in nightclubs and you got people throwing beer in your face, you can't just like kick their butt. You end up in jail. So I have this weird combination of like Tasmanian devil and like Buddhist monk. Like I'm able to like take tons. I think a lot of that comes from my childhood, from the amount of mental, emotional, and physical abuse I took growing up. I mean, you just can't hit your parents. I mean, that's just not an option, particularly your mother. So, I basically, from the time I remembered 3 until I was, until I moved out of the house when I was 16, I just massive emotional trauma and abuse with no real way to stop it on my own. Right. So I still have extreme patience. Like some people will get on coaching calls and people will be difficult and people will say, "How do you deal with that?" And I'm just like, I just do. I realize it's not me. It's something that's going on in them. But that's besides the point. But I started listening to Paul Chek, and I actually met Rob Wolf in college before he was a paleo guy. And so I started integrating a lot of these things into my life. I learned about the float tank. I started doing float tank. It took me about a year to learn how to actually calm down and relax. I tried to sit still for 30 seconds one time, and I was like a human jackhammer. And so I started using binaural beats. It was a process. I literally would sit there and I'd be like this. And then I, of course, after my back was bothering me and I went up to see Bill Hartman, and Bill was like, dude, you're so extended. Like, you need to like get some flexion in your life. You need to breathe into your low back in the car. And he explained that part of the colitis thing was me over breathing all the time and not being able to exhale and relax. Because
hold on. You're going, you're in like fast forward. This is like the movie trailer version of this story. We got to,
yes.
So you start Googling things, nicotine, aloe, and acupuncture. And this is in the weeks
stress management,
after
sleep. Yeah.
Sleep. You finally started to sleep.
Doing all this stuff. I'm doing all this stuff in the first week. I'm throwing the freaking kitchen sink at this bad boy. Right.
So you went down the podcast, blog post, rabbit hole. You consumed all the content. You assaulted the content on ulcerative colitis like it was D-Day, and you were Patton, and you were leading from the front, and you got into your Sherman tank, and
Unfortunately, Patton wasn't involved in D-Day. They used him as a diversion.
I know.
I would say analogy. I was like Erwin Rommel in North Africa, just like, we're going to outflank them, and we're going to go right, or in the beginning of World War II, when Rommel drove into France, they drove so fast that the English and the French got overwhelmed. That was my approach. And that's kind of how I am with everything. It's like, burn the ships, we're going full, like moving to Nicaragua, burn the ships. I'm moving to Nicaragua, no matter what, what it takes. That's what I'm going to do. Right. So I was doing all these things, but it took time. And then I was listening to a guy named Roy Masters, who's very interesting. I started doing his meditation, and he started talking about hate, anger, and resentment. And I sat there and I was like, he's like, that resentment just burns your nervous. It's just like a coal, like hatred. Because I hated my parents so much that if I went and seen them in person, I would start shaking. My father would call me on the phone, and I literally would want to just strangle somebody. And I was like, they did the best they could. Like, so I called my father and I said, hey, Dad, you're not going to want to hear this. But, you failed me as a parent, and I forgive you. I know you did the best you could. And his response was, well, how's the weather down there? And I was just like, that's who he is. So I was able to forgive. And that was like this humongous chain being lifted off me. All that hate, all that anger was gone. And then all of a sudden I needed to learn how to, like, motivation to work, motivation to train. That was all fueled by hate. And I didn't know how. It took me a good year or two, once I got healthier, to learn how to train, because I loved my body and I loved myself and I had value. And I wanted to do this to help other people, as opposed to or going out with a girl was basically to make myself feel better about myself, as opposed to having a relationship because I have value to add to that person. I was putting immense pressure on that person to make me feel valuable. And of course, that leads to massive frustration, because, basically it sets the expectations way too high. And if you're trying to look for somebody else to feel good about yourself, that's extremely exhausting to them. And then it ends up not ending well, obviously. So thank God I didn't do something stupid like get married at that time. It would have ended up in a total, disaster. So
if you're comfortable, I think you alluded a lot to how a lot of this started with how you grew up, what your childhood environment was like. What of that would you feel someone who's going through the process of healing needs to hear so that they can heal?
You got to forgive. Have to.
Yeah, that's so powerful.
The only person that is affected by hate is you. And really, you're giving that other person power. And I don't know, whatever you believe, but that is the enemy's goal, is to make you hate. Because that hate is being passed on to the next generation. And then you take that out on that person, and then they hate you. And so it distracts you from who you're supposed to be. It distracts you from being a person that's able to forgive, to have empathy. If you have resentment and hatred, you're going to have a miserable life. And that's why forgiveness is really the key to healing. You've got to forgive those who transgress against you. That's why it's in the Lord's Prayer.
Mm. When you
Forgive
think
those who
about
trespass against you.
when you think about how that affected your healing journey, do you have any thoughts on how that was passed down in your own family and what else could have been done to prevent that?
Well, I'm not going to get into too many details on that, but both my parents had, things that happened to them that weren't good. And it happens in families. It goes generation to generation to generation. And, I don't want to get into too many details because people are still alive, and I want to have respect for them.
Mm-hmm.
But that's generally what happens, is the pattern. The narcissist creates another narcissist, and it just kind of, somebody's got to break the chain eventually. Somebody's got to say, look, I'm going to set some boundaries. And that's why I moved out when I was 16 years old. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to have a healthy, happy life if I continue to live in this environment. And so I removed myself from that environment. And I've had to put up boundaries. I don't talk to my parents very often, if ever. And that's a personal decision. I just said, hey, if you can't conduct yourself in a certain way, I just can't deal with you. And so they continue to conduct themselves in a certain way. So I've detached myself from them. Oh, gracias. My food just arrived. Sorry.
No worries.
I told her 10:30. She's always early. So thank you.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So people are just doing the best they can. So you got to understand that most people, when they have issues, and it's probably not with you, it's probably with themselves, or something was done to them. So that makes it a lot easier. What did Jesus say? Forgive them, Lord, for they do not know what they do.
Yes. And Hosea 4:6 says, my people perish for lack of knowledge.
And I find it hard to believe that there are massive amounts of psychopaths and sociopaths that love to torture people on purpose.
It's like 1 to 3% of the population.
I would like to think it's rare. Most of the people are acting like that because it was done to them. It's not because they're deliberately making a conscious decision to torture people for fun and like a mangala and enjoy it. So go ahead.
Yeah. So you had this profound, and what was the time course over which, you said in the first week you were doing all this stuff. You drank from the fire hose, as we might say, of content and information. Yes. You made a lot of changes. You took massive action in order to change your life. And then you went to see a functional medicine doctor who found you to be deficient in many, many, many things.
I saw him before I got colitis.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
And he gave me about $700 worth of supplements and never talked about my lifestyle. He told me to get off testosterone and he's like, get off testosterone, take this herb, it'll raise your testosterone back up to normal. And he gave me 7,000 supplements, never talked to me about sleep, never talked to me about stress, nothing. He just basically handed a big bag of supplements to me. And I walked out the door, and of course that never really did anything. So, except be really expensive. So he could have had the opportunity to be like, dude, you're killing yourself. Like you need to do, you need to basically make some changes in your life.
And, did you take the supplement?
Fortunately, I did for a little while, and it really didn't do much because I was still driving my body like a stolen car. I was like, what does he know? I'll just take more caffeine.
Let's unpack that for a minute. You described it as variously as 7,000 supplements, 700 supplements, 7,000 whatever, lots and lots and lots of supplements. We're talking bottles and bottles and bottles and bottles, right? And
you were like 700 back in 2007.
Right. So that'd probably be like
Yeah.
1,000,
That's a
1,200
lot.
maybe
Yes.
today. So,
Yes,
did he expect you to take that many supplements every month?
pretty much. He's like, you can come back when you're done with these. I'm just like,
Wow.
I'm
Wow.
done with them right now.
Yeah.
I'm
This is
spending-
why
I
we
didn't
don't-
even spend that much money on anabolics. my steroids only cost like $200 a month,
And this is why we have a process where, and Jim, you've been a big part of us creating this process of, we basically don't let you do that at the practice. We make sure that you are going to have a reasonable lifestyle, because one of the things that we find is that if you are running your engine as hot and as hard as Jim was, there is no way supplements are going to make an impact. Just as Jim said, you took $700 worth or whatever of really high quality supplements and saw no significant difference. I'm not at all surprised by that. And then you ended up getting ulcerative colitis anyway. And then you dug into what really ultimately caused it, and you found all these other things that got left on the table. Or as we talk about it as like fruit on the low-hanging fruit on the tree, right? The supplements are in the middle to the top of the tree, and people are just giving you a ladder, telling you to climb up there, pick them all, when you can just run around picking the low-hanging fruit, which is ultimately the foundation, which we talk about all the time, of really amazing long-term results. So you had this period of weeks. During this period of weeks with the aloe juice and the nicotine and the acupuncture, were you taking a lot of supplements or changing your diet at all?
Oh, I went to a GAPS protocol immediately.
GAPS. Okay.
Lots of bone broth. I simplified everything, got all the gluten out. Once I started healing, I was so gluten sensitive. Like maybe it was psychological, but if I went to like Whole Foods and I had like a chicken breast that had like a sauce that had gluten in it, I would start throwing up.
Yeah.
So I think at the time it was like gluten was like, I think that was when like Wheat Belly and all that was out. And so
it was very hip,
and Dr. It was very hip. And so, that was, I think, maybe mentally part of it. But, part of it is I missed a huge part of the equation, which came out later. So in about 4 months, I was able to completely get my colitis under control. Within a couple of weeks, I was able to get the
That's
bleeding
really
stopped.
incredible.
In about 4 months, I mean, I was going all out. I mean, I was driving to Cincinnati twice a week to do a float tank because that was the only one they had in the area. I was doing like binaural beats like it was nobody's business. I was.
How did this impact your cash flow, your career? I can only imagine you started to dip into savings and stopped working and started resting.
I worked through the whole thing.
But I thought you said that
At
you
the
were
same
working at
pace?
such an exactly same pace.
Yeah.
I cut back. Well, I quit training like a maniac. So I had
Oh,
more,
okay.
and
So
I
your
stopped.
personal training time.
Yeah, and I got away from the crazy redhead, and then I quit the job working nights. So that really helped. And so the working hours, I obviously sleep. I read about sleep, and I became friends with Dr. Kirk Parsley at that time as well. And Kirk helped me with figuring out the right amount of HRT, so to speak, for me at the time. And Kirk was very helpful, and he understood my mindset. The guy was a SEAL, guy's a doctor for the SEALs, so he kind of understands the crazy in my head, and he also understands going through the mental gymnastics. So I got that under control, and years go by. I'd started a gym with my business partner, and I'm dating a young lady, and I go to get a pedicure, and all of a sudden 4 or 5 days later, I'm in the emergency room. They're prepping to amputate my leg.
We're gonna have to save that for episode 2, Jim.
Okay. All right.
Because I want to keep these under an hour. But suffice it to say that you eliminated gluten, you eliminated dairy, you simplified your diet, went to a GAPS protocol, stopped training like a maniac, stopped working nights, started resting, started sleeping, implemented acupuncture. When did you see Bill Hartman? Because you talked about seeing Bill Hartman as part of this whole thing. Or was that later?
I had saw Bill Hartman. I saw Bill Hartman just a couple months after I'd gotten colitis, because I was having problems getting my back to feel better after the car wreck. And he was just like, And I think a lot of it too is I was slowing down. I was becoming more mindful. Before, I didn't even know my back hurt because I was just like, I don't have time for my back to hurt. Like
Yeah,
when you're
running
so
Yeah.
revved up and you're
Mhm.
producing so much cortisol, like I don't feel pain. Like literally, like people don't
Yeah.
understand. Like you could
Yeah.
hit me with a hammer. You could, like, I walked into the door frame the other day, split my head open and like cut my eye, and I just
Oh
like, oh,
no.
oops, I mean, it's just like I don't like, I don't feel stuff like that. So I think part of it was becoming more aware of my body and actually listening to my body. And then I
So you
saw
already
Bill, and
knew
he's like, "Dude,
Bill
you got to do some."
Hartman before this.
Mhm.
Okay. And do you think
Yes, I've known Bill for a long time.
you think he had recommendations that helped you recover from the ulcerative colitis?
Oh, well, definitely being more aware of my breathing, and I don't even know what my respiratory rate. I had Joel Jameson gave me like the first version of HRV, which was called Bioforce, and I remember my HOV was like 4 or something like that when I started. My resting heart rate was stupid. It was ridiculous. So I would probably guess I probably had a 30 respiratory rate, probably. It was
A 30?
295 pounds. Yeah, just based on if I see what I feel like when I have like when I had that little hiccup like a year or two ago when I had that really
Sure.
bad fever, my respiratory rate was like 22.
Mhm.
Um
Um,
Usually around 12. So I know what 22 feels like, and I probably was running 28 to 30, maybe 25 to 30 on a regular basis because I used over breathing and to lift heavier things, right? Which is great,
Mhm.
which is fine to
mm,
lift heavier things, but you got to be able to shut that off when you're done, right? And I didn't do that. I just kept revving and revving and revving, and I just kept taking more stimulants to keep revving, and then the wheels blow off the car, right? So, but
And
Bill
so
Bill
after
really helped me understand the exhalation part of things. And once I started exhaling and putting my body in positions where I could exhale and take a full exhale, it really made a big difference in getting me to relax and calm down. He's like, dude, if you're breathing this much and you're over breathing and you can't go the opposite direction, even when you sleep, you're going to be revved up. So that was a big part of it.
and so after 4 months, your
Mhm.
ulcerative colitis was in complete remission. Fair?
Mhm. Fair.
Was it
Mhm.
healed? Were you completely better?
Yeah, I mean, my digestion started to improve. I would have a hiccup if I had gluten or something like that, but it was better. Better than, I mean, it was anything's better than what it was. And I was doing way better. I felt better. I started um my body composition was, I mean, I wasn't fat before, but like when you're
Mm.
285 pounds, like you're gonna have a little bit of body fat. But I
Mhm.
started getting a lot leaner. I started doing some movement. I started training again, but it wasn't like, death metal and bang your head against the wall.
And
It
ammonia
was,
caps?
and no, yeah, I stopped the ammonia caps, but I still, I'm such a terrible person. I
No,
would
you're not.
sneak up behind a girl I like at the gym, and I'd crack the ammonia cap, and I'd walk up behind her, and I'd just put it under her nose real quick. Just the reaction. Yeah, it was bad at the time.
Wow.
But I mean, yeah, it got me a lot of dates though. Any girl I did that to would go out on a date with me. It's funny how that works. It gets their attention.
Okay. Got it. Unconventional dating advice with Jim Laird.
Yes, not recommended. I don't recommend that.
I don't
But
recommend
that's
that
the kind
either,
of stuff.
especially
That's the, yeah. That's the
that's
I
kind
do
of
not approve.
personality I had to begin with.
I think in
Yeah.
2024 there might be
I,
some stiffer penalties or consequences for that in certain
oh
places.
yeah, it was totally different in 2008, 2007. But it was I was just a big, loud, obnoxious person, and that was part of being a big, loud, obnoxious person.
So 4 months, ulcerative colitis completely healed. Did you see any
Mhm.
practitioners do any other lab testing, take any other supplements in order to get that outcome?
Nope.
So, what would you say to sum it up, wrap it up for somebody who's dealing with a new diagnosis of a chronic disease, who's looking at a long term prognosis that's probably been handed to them by a medical professional or by society or by Dr. Google? And one thing that I'll mention here that's important is that I remember what it was like to use the internet and search functions in order to find information 5, 10, 20 years ago. It was amazing. And now it is absolutely just thought control propaganda coming up at the top of every search function. You cannot find basic information about natural medicine. The kind of things that Jim used to reinvent his health, if you go out and try and find them through Google or any other search engine that's based on Google, which is practically all of them as far as I know, you will not get this information. It's now all behind paywalls. It's on these niche websites that you'll never find. It's been memory holed. I've got friends who went from crazy Google traffic to nothing overnight.
Rob Wolf.
Yeah,
he used to be one of the #1 health people, and he went to like not even being found on the front page.
And the reality is they just don't want people to have access to this information.
Yeah.
Because there's such a profit to be made when people are chronically ill. Like you mentioned your father, ostomy bags, ostomy supplies, diabetes medications, and anti or immunosuppressive agents. Then you get on all the drugs for the anxiety and the depression and the fatigue that come along with all that. So there's a massive gravy train that wants people to not do what Jim did, which is and we're going to cover, I want to go over your issue with the your leg and your recurring infections another episode, but there's a huge industry and set of industries that don't want people like Jim to go from gurney in the hospital about to have their colon out, destined or doomed at that moment to a lifetime of drugs, surgeries, doctor's visits, and medications, to Jim Laird living in rural Nicaragua on zero. Well, I don't know if I can say zero. I won't speak for you, but
HRT.
You are dependent upon a very small number of things to perform at a very high level and enjoy your life and live well. And you're certainly not, glued to some doctor's prescription pad in relative terms.
Yeah. For 50 years old, I think I'm doing pretty good. I mean, I can run circles around people half my age in the gym. I played soccer for 45 minutes with 10-year-olds yesterday and didn't like break my leg or die of a heart attack.
Yeah.
So I'm doing pretty good. Now I know you're going to ask me next, what would be the biggest advice you could give to people that are in a bad place? Slow down and listen to what your body's telling you. I was so caught up in repressing my thoughts, repressing the voices in my head, that I never stopped and slowed down. My body was trying to tell me to stop. My body was trying to tell me to rest. It was making me tired for a reason, and I just overrid it with caffeine effect. There was a point I took so many stimulants, I could take 2 caffeine pills, which are 200 milligrams a piece, and 6 ephedra tablets and an aspirin and go take a nap.
Wow.
That's how many stimulants I was taking.
Wow.
So my body was trying to tell me to slow down, and I was just like, screw that. My bearings on my wheels were making noise. There's smoke coming out of the engine, and I'm like, screw this. I'm gonna put it down. Put the pedal down. And you've gotta slow down and listen, because your body will tell you what it needs if you have the courage to sit down, experience the pain, accept responsibility for your dumbassery, which is what I had to do. I've been a dumbass. Learn from it. And the good news is when you learn these things, you can help others. That is the key. And so I'm very grateful for my childhood. I'm very grateful for my past. I'm very grateful for the stupidity that I did to myself, because it allows me to have an empathy and a way of reading people that I think that most people don't have. I have an intuition that I've been told this anyways. So I'm not trying to blow my own trumpet, but I have an intuition of when to be firm, when to be empathetic, when to be stern, and when to give people a hug. Just because I've been through so much myself, and I have empathy and sympathy, and I've been at rock bottom, and I know what that's like. So be still and know, and don't be afraid of what comes up, because it might be the #1 thing you need to take care of. Don't be afraid of silence. Make time for it. And I think you'll be amazed at what the good Lord, or whoever you believe in, will reveal to you. Just have the courage to to actually deal with it instead of being distracted by working too much or doing dumb things or spending money and doing whatever it is you do to medicate yourself. Have the courage to take it head on and deal with it.
One of the things I've noticed, working with you, working with our patients, our clients, is that the people who most need to hear that and take action on it are the ones who most vigorously deny that it's for them.
Correct.
Mm.
It takes usually a couple months with those people of me saying over and over again, hey, I actually just got off a call with a lady who was like that for probably 3 or 4 months. She's finally like, I get it now. I finally get it. I don't have to do everything perfect, but I just have to I found a couple simple things that I like to do, and it's made a big difference for me. Thank you for that. And
oh, that's wonderful.
It sometimes takes time for people to hear this message, and you have to be, when I remember when I first started working with you, and I told you about how many years it would take or months for some people to buy into what I'm selling. And you're like, you got to be kidding. And I'm like, no, people are going to need to hear the same message over and over again. And they're going to be so sick and tired of hearing it that it's just like you feel like a broken record. And it doesn't matter whether it's training or working out or anything. That's why people have coaches in the NFL, because these guys have been playing football their whole life and they still make dumb mistakes. And the coach has to hold them accountable. They still need to do all these little simple drills that they find boring and they'd skip if they didn't have the coach there to do that. It's the same thing with life. Most people don't have the self-discipline to self-regulate. Even myself, I need accountability as well. So having a mentor, having someone to give you guidance to help keep you accountable, because our lives in the past would automatically give us the things we need. We wouldn't have screens. There was, when I grew up, there was 3 TV channels. So you couldn't binge watch Netflix for like 3 days. There just wasn't enough good content. You'd be watching the same show over and over again.
Right.
I mean, you can only watch the Three Stooges so many times, right?
Right.
So, now we have this ability to veg out and check out for hours on end. We don't have children aren't playing outside. They don't do puzzles. They don't draw anymore. They're glued to their screen. So we got to make these conscious choices to be more present, to get out in nature, and to really slow down and be present, not live in the future or the past, but live in your present moment.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, it's been great chatting with you. Thank you for this.
It's an incredible
We
story.
look forward to part 2, where we will talk about the next. It's really just, I don't know how else to put it. It's part 2 of Jim's health and wellness saga. On to the next crisis. I just figured out, I have it all figured out. And then the next thing comes along and I get hit in the face with, oh yeah, you've got this, and this right, but you missed this huge part. And I had to be taught the hard way, of course, about it. So thanks for having me on. But probably, the much as I talk, it'll probably be part 3, part 4, part 5, but we'll see about that.
Cliffhanger for part 2.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us.
My eyes are brown, so I've got lots to share. So
thanks everyone for joining us. Again, the podcast is at stillmanmd.substack.com if you'd like to get it delivered straight to your email inbox. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.